Hello, I'm Jenny Hunt. My PhD was looking at how disability is represented in museums in the UK, and today I'm talking about disability and difference. Disabled individuals have always existed, but their presence is often looked. So here we're going to look at why disability can be hard to find and how important it is to consider disability when we think about the past. Certain stories have historically been overlooked and minimised. These stories that aren't what is called stale, male, and pale, which has often removed stories about resistance and also looking at oppression to give a view of the past that can be quite idealised. Stories involving race, gender, sexuality, disability, and class have often been overlooked. However, it is important to consider these stories for an accurate view of the past and a truthful understanding of history, and this is pointed out by Catherine Ott in her 2005 work, where she says that until recently, the most common physical traits included being arthritic, stooped, pockmarked, scarred, toothless, or bent and injured in some way. Another way to consider the sheer amount of disabled people in the past is simply to picture a crowd and think about how many of those people would be wearing glasses. Historically, you might not have access to such things to correct your vision, and therefore you would find yourself partially sighted. So if these stories are so common, why are they overlooked? So there's three big reasons that can make it hard to talk about disability. One of them is that there can be reluctance to out people as having been disabled. It can be seen almost as something to be shameful, which it shouldn't be. But for example, when it comes to figures such as Nelson or Henry VIII, there can actually be quite a pushback to considering them as having a disability, even though it's quite clear that they did following various injuries. There can be a concern that these mentions are only tokenistic, and also a lot of the time we won't have the necessary records to name disabled people. For example, if you've got a prosthetic, you might find that it's something that has been used over time and by multiple people without necessarily recording who they were. Also, a lot of everyday items will have been used by disabled people as well as by non-disabled people. So a lot of this work on disability and the importance of acknowledging it comes from the disability rights movement, which started in the 1970s. This challenged the medical model at the time, which I'll talk more about on the next slide, and also stereotypes, which could often limit the lives of disabled people. It was formed of a group of disabled individuals advocating for their own rights, and it focused on this idea of nothing about us without us. So this idea that when we're considering disability, which we need to do, we need to try and make sure that disabled voices are within the room and being heard and listened to. This is also true when we look at disability in the past, trying to make sure that when we're talking about what those lives were like, we listen to modern disabled people who may be able to provide their own insights. So I mentioned previously the social versus the medical model. Just going to give you a really quick overview of this because this isn't necessarily how disability was seen in the past, but it's important to understand if we're looking at disability now. So the medical model kind of places the problem or the blame on the disabled individual. So in this image, the problem is that the person isn't able to walk up the stairs. The social model instead looks at the barrier. So for them, the problem, such as it is that there is no ramp, so that there are stairs which are stopping this individual from being able to go to where they want to get to. So it's this idea of looking at the barriers that society puts in place when we consider disability. The view of what makes someone disabled has really changed across time, and we'll see that a bit later as well, that our understanding of disability is not necessarily how people understood it in the past, but that doesn't mean that disabled people weren't present and weren't an important part of society as they indeed are today. So why is it important we consider disability? Well, when I was working with various museums for my PhD, I spoke to the staff about why they thought it mattered that they were telling these stories now when they hadn't necessarily told these stories in the past. And what came across was the fascinating nature of these stories, the importance of representation, and also the fact that these are often stories that people can be quite passionate about. This idea of really wanting disabled people's struggles to be acknowledged and their achievements to be celebrated. This idea of a very good story involving struggles for social justice, which is something that's relevant far more widely. Um, it also means that stereotypes can be challenged, and to make sure that people realise that disabled individuals are present now and were also present in the past, and that even historically it was often disabled people who were doing the advocating for themselves. It also was clear that by talking about disabled people and talking with disabled people in order to create the exhibitions, a more humanised version could come across, one that actually acknowledged disabled people in both the past and present as people, rather than focusing solely on the disability. So when I'm talking about the fact that evidence of disability is everywhere, even if we don't necessarily see it, I thought it would be helpful if I talked through a past exhibition that I was involved in. So what does it mean when we look at the past with this understanding of disability? Well, in 2021, I worked with Compton Verney to look through their folk art collection through a disability lens, and I was able to pick out a wide range of objects that had a link to disability. And I'm just going to quickly talk you through them now to show the kind of range of impacts that disability has and the marks that it leaves. So our first one is a sign related to basket weaving, which is a career that was traditionally taught in blind schools. And whilst this would be a useful career enabling people to earn money, it was sometimes taught in preference to academic skills and therefore limited people's futures. Next is a sign of a boar's head, which was the symbol of Richard III. Richard III was famously disabled, and that disability was picked up on by his Tudor opponents and used to kind of defame him. Next, we have a sign for a clog shop, and clogs are shoes that are very easy to adapt for different needs. So they serve as a kind of a prosthetic clothing, because if, for example, you have one leg that is slightly shorter or longer than the other, they can be used to kind of adjust for that. Next, I have a picture of Margate, which became used as a health resort, people coming to take the sea air there. And this idea of getting out into the countryside, getting fresh air, was used as both the treatment for illness and for disability, most famously places like Bath. Next to that, there is this beautiful military patchwork, which was made by injured soldiers as part of what we would now think of as occupational therapy. It's teaching new skills and also helping to kind of recover from injury, and this kind of thing is very commonly continued now, so it's quite an interesting piece to see being made historically as well. Next, there is this town scene. Towards the front there is a man of short stature who has been identified as Harry Pickle. Now, whilst people of short stature might now fall under the category of disabled because of how society treats them, historically he would not have been considered disabled because he was working, and the understanding of disability at the time was very much focused on people who were unable to work. But the fact that he is being commemorated in the street scene shows him as part of the community and kind of welcomed and accepted there. Next, we have a top hat, which this is actually a sign, but the top hat industry used a lot of mercury, and that had a real impact on the people who were working with it, and it would make them very sick and lead to tremors and neurological issues. Beside that is a portrait of Daniel Lambert, who during his lifetime was a celebrity as the fattest man in Britain. He had previously been working as a jail keeper where he was known to be being very kind, and after he struggled to find further employment, so he took a house in London, charged people to talk to him, and once he had made sufficient money, he then went home to Leicester to breed dogs. After that, there is a sign to the patron saint of chimney sweeps, and that was another profession that caused a lot of injury and a lot of disablement. Besides that is an image for a trade union, and trade unions, part of the reason they grew up was to kind of combat this really harsh working conditions which were causing a lot of damage and a lot of injury. And finally, there is a boat named the Sunbeam, which the woman who was part of the family that owned that wrote stories about their travels. She had been severely burned as a child and also had bronchitis, and also this boat later served as a hospital ship during World War I. So there is just a really quick overview of a collection and looking at all of these objects that link to disability and disabled stories in varied ways. So, as a conclusion, disability historically has been very widespread but often not recorded, and we need to start considering it, recognising the lived experiences of disabled people in the past, because that gives us a much more accurate understanding of what the past was like. And when we are looking at how we tell these stories, it's very important to bring in the voices of disabled people in order to share their experiences. Even though the lives of a modern disabled person and one in history would be quite different, there will still be certain shared experiences there. The kinds of stories we share make it clear what we actually value as a society, and it's really important that we acknowledge diversity and complexity in all its different ways. Thank you for listening. This is a link to my X account, Our Objects, where every day I go through and I list an object that is related to disability to try and show the wide range of traces that disabled lives have left. Thank you.